Good evening. My name is Elisa and I will be your host for today's event. Please allow me to give a quick introduction of what the Gallen Symposium is before we begin. In 1968, 5 students of the University of St. Gallen came together amidst the student protests against corporations at the time. They decided to create a platform in which the voice of the youth can be heard and direct and tangible action can be taken as a result, achieving a form of mutual understanding through decisions and discussions on an equal and open platform, transforming thoughts into actions. As a result, over the past 51 years, we have seen tremendous growth in the symposium and mutual benefit from both senior leaders and our leaders of tomorrow. This brings us to the present-day Gallen Symposium, which is a 2-day event taking place in May at the campus of the University of St. Gallen. It is organized by us, a team of 30 students, and is strongly supported by our foundation as well. Together, we share the mutual goal of fostering cross-generational dialogue. We do this through debates and workshops, which take place at our conference, focusing on encouraging exchange between our senior leaders and our leaders of tomorrow. In addition, we also have various year-round events, such as this one, in which we try and take away those ideas out of those 2 days and ensure that consistent and feasible change can be taken. The topic of this year's Gallen Symposium is a new generational contract. Senior leaders and leaders of tomorrow come together to create a set of principles of actions, what we call them, at the symposium, in which they describe a set of actions they agree to abide by and incorporate into their daily practices to ensure that the necessary steps are taken to ensure a brighter future worth living for us and the generations to follow. Naturally, the topic of resilient businesses and economies also falls under that. So how do we get you involved? Well, for individuals currently in their master's or PhD and are under the age of 30, you fall under our category of leaders of tomorrow. The top 100 essays of our global essay competition will be chosen, and you will be invited to attend the Gallen Symposium. Not only this, but you will have a week's trip to Switzerland, all expenses paid for. You can apply through either the QR code listed on the PowerPoint or through our website. Our main goal here is to ensure that the most talented youths gain access to our conference, regardless of their socioeconomic background. We want to make sure that everyone has equal access to our conference. For senior leaders here in the audience today, if the voices of the youth and the shaping of an even brighter future for our next generations is something that interests you, I can explain what we do in greater detail, and we can see how to get you involved as well. Without further ado, please welcome Mr. Beat Ulrich, CEO of the Gallen Symposium, to deliver his welcome remarks. Beat.
Thank you very much, Alissa. She's the representative of the International Students Committee that pauses each year the studies for a full year and represents us here in Singapore at our beautiful office on Amoy Street. Dear Minister Desmond Lee, dear Ambassador, dear panelists, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, I'm very pleased to have our 7th Gallen Symposium Singapore Forum already here today. The idea of today and the context is to give a regional perspective to the global conference held in May in Switzerland. And we know that we have overlapping challenges in these times and different views on these challenges and different views also on the topic of a new general contract. And that's the idea why we gather today to create this regional view on the new generational contract. I want to thank here at the beginning, of course, the minister, and he's in a row. We have a strong presence of Singapore each year in St. Gallen in Switzerland, and strong ties with Singapore, together with companies from Singapore, together with students that qualify from Singapore for St. Gallen. I want to thank you, Minister Desmond Lee, for joining today and joining then also as a speaker at the 52nd St. Gallen Symposium. But also again, thank you panelists for contributing to the regional dialogue. And a very big thank you goes to NYAAC and in person to James So, who for more than 24 years now has contributed to this connection between St. Gallen and Singapore. So give a big hand to James So, Eileen Yap and the team of NYAAC. So I wish you a very interesting and inspiring event here today, and hopefully have a few of you then in St. Gallen as well next May. Thank you so much, and I guess directly over to the Swiss ambassador here in Singapore, Mr. Grütter. Thank you so much.
Dear Minister, dear James, dear panelists, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me? This quote is from the late American actor and comedian Groucho Marx, and it reminds us that every society has to answer the question about the relation between the younger and older generation at its time. And many of today's challenges, such as global warming, the loss of biodiversity, the future of work, are existential in nature. And it is not surprising that a person at the age of 20 gives or has a different approach to these challenges than someone who is 80 years old. But at the same time, I would strongly caution against assuming that the older generation and older generations are indifferent or are neglecting the younger ones. Experience shows that the elderly deeply care about the young and vice versa. I give you one example. In Europe, we not only have the climate youth. These are the young people who demonstrate against climate change and against the inertia of politicians. We also have a group of so-called climate seniors who have taken to the courts to fight for more ambitious climate measures. And whatever you think of the methods of these two groups, their engagement shows that both old and young share in their concern for the world. And the difference often lies within the approach they are taking. Or another example, during the pandemic, we could witness the huge solidarity between the young and the old, because it was the young people who were predominantly suffering from the measures, the sanitary measures that governments had to take, from the closures of bars, of restaurants, of cultural events, of sporting events. And the younger generations accepted these measures with a lot of patience and also indulgence. And I am convinced that it needs both sides to come to good solutions. The more radical spirit, probably of the younger generations, combined with the experience of the older generations. And this is why an intergenerational dialogue is so important. A dialogue where the voice of all age groups is heard and taken into account. Secretary General Guterres has acknowledged this in his comprehensive reform agenda for the UN, which he submitted about a year ago. He proposed the creation of a UN Council for Future Generations. He proposed the adoption of a UN Declaration on Future Generations and the establishment of a UN Youth Office, and all of this to better take into account the views of younger people into the policy and normative discussions in New York. And in 2024, there will be a very big summit, a high-level summit in New York, where the state of the world and how youth can be involved will be discussed. The objective, I believe, is clear. We must achieve the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And reaching these goals will be very difficult. But framing the underlying global challenges as a generational issue will make the task only bigger, as it is polarizing and splitting our societies. And I believe a better way forward consists in an honest and evidence-based dialogue among stakeholders, including the young and the old. And it is great that today's evening and the St. Gallen Symposium in May offer a platform for exactly such a dialogue. And the stakes are high, but so is my interest for the minister's speech and tonight's panel discussion. And that's why I stop it now and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Gritter, for your remarks. It is my pleasure now to invite Mr. Desmond Lee, Minister of National Development for Singapore, onto the stage to deliver his keynote speech. Minister Desmond Lee.
Very good evening, Mr. Beat Ulrich, CEO of St. Gallen Foundation, Your Excellency, Mr. Frank Gutter, Ambassador of Switzerland to Singapore, Mr. Tony So, my predecessor, Mr. Mabao Tan, fellow panelists, friends, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening to all of you. And before I came into this hall, I inquired who the audience would comprise of, and very encouraged to see a good representation of the next generation from a whole range of institutes of higher learning coming together and engaging each other on important topics like this. This year's theme, A New Generational Compact, reflects a crossroad that the world has now come to amid rapid technological changes, social and demographic shifts, and upheaval, and a worsening climate crisis. This brings with it challenges and opportunities, but also risks. The social compact in Singapore has evolved over the decades as our society, economy, and the world around us changed. For instance, there was a very strong emphasis on individual responsibility and self-reliance in our post-independence years, as very limited resources were focused on basic universal needs such as housing, healthcare, education, and job creation. And the older generation who are represented here will remember what self-reliance and individual responsibility meant in terms of the interface between policy and lived experience on the ground. And so charities, religious institutions came on board, partnered the government to provide support for groups of Singaporeans that would need additional help. As our economy grew, our social compact evolved and developed to include a greater sense of collective responsibility and participation, with more targeted support towards the lower income and vulnerable. This reflected the government's and society's concerns about the widening income gap and those who may be left behind due to rapid shifts in our local and the global labor market and economy. Now, today, the challenges faced by countries around the world, including here in Singapore, are more profound and complex than ever. Between Switzerland and Singapore, we're very vastly different in terms of size and geography, but there are many things that bind us together, common challenges that this symposium can bring young people together to tackle. Globally, we are in a period of greater geopolitical contestation, economic bifurcation, and we face the risk of recession and slowdown, with impact on jobs, families, and livelihoods. Domestically, Singaporeans' aspirations are becoming a lot more diverse than in the past. Family sizes are shrinking, our economy is maturing, and our population rapidly aging. So it's timely that my colleague DPM Lawrence Wong launched Forward Singapore last year. It aims to take stock, bring Singaporeans together, examine where we are as a society, as an economy, as a nation, examine our values and aspirations, and to build consensus to refresh our social compact for a new generation ahead of us. Today, I will share some brief thoughts about the intergenerational compact here in Singapore and how it impacts the way we design and plan our city-state and use our limited land and resources. And I look forward to listening to your ideas and reflections and those of my fellow panelists later. And of course, this sets the stage for us to bring ideas to St. Gallen in May, to engage the youth of Switzerland, of Europe, and of the world. Now, our starting point here is that we are a diverse, multicultural, cosmopolitan Asian society living in a small city-state, and that word city-state is important. To put it into context, Singapore, with a land area of about 730 square kilometers, is less than 2% the size of Switzerland, but with about 2/3 in terms of population size. Hence, we have to make difficult choices, and I would say magnified difficulty in choices between the many needs and the unlimited wants of today versus setting aside enough space and resources to meet uncertain challenges of tomorrow. There is always a temptation to exhaust all our land and consume our fiscal reserves to make popular choices to meet the needs of today's generation. I think that's natural. But that was not the approach our pioneer leaders took. Instead, they were disciplined, far-sighted, to make difficult trade-offs and long-term plans that had set our generation up for success. And if you examine what they did in the past, they made those choices in the context of a Singapore that was really just newly independent with very little resources, but a whole lot of problems to tackle. One graphic case in point is our Marina Bay business and financial district. You see that as a site that's gradually being built up, but examine how it came to be, with its iconic Singapore skyline. They started planning for Marina Bay as far back as the 1970s, so shortly after independence, with those issues to grapple with, that were present issues to deal with people concerned about those issues. But when we look at history, they were already planning in the 70s for this district, which was then the sea. When our city planners foresaw that our city centre would need to be expanded if Singapore was to succeed as a business and financial hub. It took more than 30 years of painstaking planning, investment and preparation before developments in Marina Bay started taking shape in the new millennium. And in fact, even today, they're still growing and developing Marina Bay. Some of those who envisioned Marina Bay knew that they might not be around to see the fruits of their dream and of their labor. But that did not affect their determination to keep improving Singapore. Another critical principle that our pioneers set out was the protection of what we call the state's reserves, which enabled us to build up a rainy day fund. We tapped on these recently to fund 5 budgets to tide us through the biggest crisis our generation has seen. Growing, stewarding, protecting, and shepherding and husbanding these resources in our reserves is fundamental for a city-state like ours. It is a principle that we must continue to uphold over the generations, especially as we head into a future fraught with challenges such as climate change and greater geopolitical uncertainty. This spirit of stewardship is a defining feature of the social compact that we've inherited, that is core to our Singapore identity. That this city and its resources are not for us to just use and consume in our generation, but that we have a duty to steward it wisely and grow it for the next generation. Similar to how our pioneers planned for Marina Bay, we've started planning and preparing for the development of the greater southern waterfront, amongst others. And we had announced this back in 2013. It will open up a large stretch of prime land along our southern coastline for future generations to live, work, dream, and play. The greater southern waterfront will be developed progressively and is expected to be fully realized only after the 2040s. This is a major multi-decade effort, and really, it's not just drawing some lines on a map. It's really a Herculean effort to move 2 ports, do land preparation, land reclamation, and a lot of work to make that land available for a generation that may not yet be born. We are undertaking this now to create the space that we know our future generations will need. We also innovate in our housing and land use solutions. My colleagues are here from the URA. Our long-term plan review, which concluded last year and which engaged more than 15,000 people, spawned a whole range of innovative ideas, because if you're a steward, and these are not just your resources to use, but to plan and use them in the best interest of the next generation, you have to be innovative. And it spawned ideas such as public housing flats that may be offered with open plans to allow homeowners flexibility to configure the spaces according to their own needs as they change over time. That's quite micro. But at a macro level, the idea of a vertical zoning concept in our industrial and business estates to allow a mix of different but complementary uses within a single development. So the idea of vertical zoning and possibly the idea of a business-wide model. And so some early dreams that were in the long-term plan report included, say, on the ground floor, some showrooms, the second floor, some light industry, third floor, some R&D, fourth floor, maybe some working spaces, fifth floor, some co-living spaces, and so on. And these are early ideas which reflect a steward's responsibility to innovate in order to harness resources passed down by previous generations to enable the next generation to thrive. Another aspect of stewardship in the context of a social compact is the need to make sure that we do not unnecessarily indenture future generations through debt that we incur for needs of our own generation. Nevertheless, for development of significant infrastructure that will generate yield and benefit many future generations, for example, Terminal 5 expansion of our airport, it would be equitable to expect future generations to share in the costs as much as the benefits. And this can be achieved, for instance, through the issuance of infrastructure bonds that are paid by the current generations and paid through future generations as well. But we recognize that the context and challenges we face today are different from those of previous generations that require different sets of resiliencies. So our social compact will need to evolve to be fit for our time and for the next. But we remain responsible and disciplined to acknowledge and make difficult trade-offs and to be honest about them. Our approach to home ownership is one example. Today, our city-state has perhaps one of the highest home ownership rates in the world, close to 90%. This is higher than the United Kingdom and United States at 63 and 65% respectively. More remarkably, around 85% of lower income households own their own homes, something that may not be as common around the world. But demand for housing is broad-based and will continue to grow, even if the Singaporean population doesn't grow as fast as before. And this is driven by social trends, such as family nuclearization, so you see a lot fewer three-generation families, but nuclear families, more singles, aging and active longevity, and just the sheer aspiration for more space. But even as we try to meet the growing housing demand as a result of all these factors, we need to continue to be good stewards of land and resources. It is ultimately an allocation of these resources to meet not just housing needs, but also the needs of many other aspects of society and economy. We maximize the potential of our limited land through greater land use intensification, for example, building higher, building more densely, at human scale, livable scale, and by rejuvenating older estates and older developments through development and through lease renewal. We prioritize needs such as those buying their first home to start a family, but also make sure you provide options for different demographics of Singaporeans. At the same time, we aspire to conserve more green spaces and protect more of our built heritage, as Singaporeans yearn for more greenery in our city and aspire to conserve biodiversity in a dense city. And to conserve these against pressing competing needs such as healthcare, education, transport, industry, and many others. And we do all this without exhausting all available developable land to reserve space and optionality for future generations to dream, to grow, and to develop. And we reserve optionality physically by keeping spaces available for them, free of development, but also ensure optionality that by the time their generation comes of age, the land can be rejuvenated for them to have a free hand to draw, develop, build, and live their dreams. Against this backdrop of land constraints, Singapore, like other cosmopolitan cities, also needs to contend with invisible social and economic forces that, if left entirely to their own devices, can cause social stratification and division. You can see that in successful cities, where certain areas become the domain of the wealthy, and other parts, even in inner cities, being less developed. This can manifest itself in housing and where people live. So our social compact to keep society cohesive means that we must proactively act against these forces, not leave them laissez-faire to develop based on market forces. And one way we do this is through the provision of more support for lower income families who may generally have fewer housing options. We recognize that having a stable living environment is important to improve intergenerational mobility. So we provide highly subsidized rental housing under the public rental scheme as a social safety net. To ensure that our public housing remains inclusive, such public rental flats, which are flats provided at low rent to people who have no other housing options. To ensure that it remains inclusive, these flats are built alongside or even within the very same building as sold flats. And in our very first prime location housing project in the heart of the city, it was a deliberate decision to incorporate public rental housing flats in the same block as sold flats, larger flats, and on the same lift landing as well. Beyond the provision of housing, we have also implemented what we call comlink rental flats or community-linked rental flats, as well as the Fresh Start housing scheme to empower families with children who are living in rental housing, and that is a proxy for being financially vulnerable, to help uplift their lives and to marshal resources, policies, programs, and support for them to have a brighter future, to make sure that poverty doesn't transfer down the generations for these families. So it's not simply the provision of housing as infrastructure at affordable rent, but providing the opportunity for a trampoline, housing with proactive social support in a proactive, coordinated way. We're trying this out, rolling it out nationally, and we'll see if it makes a difference to intergenerational equity. Another aspect of our intergenerational compact is how we provide and care for our seniors, people who worked hard in the early days to make this city what it is today. And Ambassador spoke about intergenerational conversations between the young and the old. I've spoken about the current generation and the next generation not yet born, but remembering our seniors, honoring them, looking after them when they grow old is important. Not just because it's right to do so, but because all of us will age and hopefully age gracefully in time. With an aging population, we will require an increase in our social expenditure that needs to be paid for from new revenue sources. We have to refresh and calibrate our social compact carefully to be sustainable and to avoid intergenerational divides which have polarized the political landscapes in some societies. For example, we provide extra support to particular generations of older Singaporeans who have contributed to nation building, both the Pioneer and Merdeka generation packages, for instance, by setting aside funds from today's budget, today's revenues and resources, and not burdening future generations. These pioneers contributed significantly to nation building during Singapore's early years, but did not fully benefit from our economic growth later on. And doing these things are the right things to do. These are important societal values we want to reinforce, a sense of gratitude and respect to those who came before us. From the infrastructure's point of view, we're doing the same. We are also shifting to a community-based model of care for our elderly to age in place. So again, not just infrastructure, but infrastructure with care, support, and community programming. We are innovating with new models of public housing for seniors, such as community care apartments, which is a new typology for assisted living that integrates housing with care services and fosters community network to engage and support our seniors. Just a few days ago, we also did groundbreaking for Heart of UT, which provides senior housing together with a range of other public services and amenities that the seniors will need And so it becomes a vertical village. So they don't have to travel, they travel vertically to access some of these resources. And for a different segment of our seniors who may have more resources, we have launched a government land sales program to allow the private sector to develop some of these infrastructure and care options for assisted retirement living. Now, moving away from social and housing aspects, but still also fixated on the point of infrastructure planning, is the need to prepare our city for climate change. Climate change is an important challenge of our time that has long-lasting impact for generations to come. And it is our duty to future generations to get this right. We can only get this right once. And Singapore is doing our part. We have set an ambitious national target to achieve net zero by 2050 and launched the Singapore Green Plan 2030, which seeks to be a whole-of-nation movement to pursue sustainable development, with a clear eye on all the things that we need to do to ensure that we achieve net zero as a small city-state by 2050. Initiatives within the plan cut across different sectors, from energy to transport, housing, and even the education sector. For the built environment, we launched the Singapore Green Building Master Plan in 2021, with several targets, including greening 80% of our buildings by GFA by the end of this decade. We are also preparing to adapt. Climate change could cause mean sea level around Singapore to rise by up to 1 meter by the end of this century. With extreme high tides and storm surges, sea levels could rise to be as high as 4 to 5 meters, high enough to potentially flood 1/3 of our city-state. Some of our biggest investments ahead of us, therefore, will be in coastal protection, such as seawalls and natural barriers like mangroves and other nature-based solutions. These are long-term investments and could cost $100 billion or more over the next 50 to 100 years. And this once again highlights the importance for us to save assiduously and to build up our reserves for rainy and quite literally stormy days ahead. The many efforts and initiatives that I've mentioned this evening are long-term and multi-generational. They do not just end with this term of government or the next. In fact, the benefits may not be reaped until way past our own time here. There are trade-offs to be made, and some of the policies may not be popular and may perhaps not sit well with everyone. But ultimately, every dollar that we spend on climate change mitigation and adaptation, as well as the many policies we have to ensure to ensure sustainable development and intergenerational equity, comes from a dollar that could have been spent on meeting current demands or support for those who might need it today. So tough questions and decisions to be made. But these long-term projects are not wasteful expenditures. On the contrary, they are critical projects that are needed to ensure the very survival of our city-state. There will be no Singapore for our grandchildren and their children if we fail to plan ahead or mitigate the existential risks we foresee today. We must therefore continue to save up, plan for the future, maintain social cohesion even amidst diverse viewpoints, and work together to implement these projects over the decades to come. This tension between the current and future generations, not just the current generation and the previous generation, as well as the need to strike a balance between them, is not unique to Singapore. Through this symposium, we hope to engage in meaningful conversations with countries and organizations around the world, and most certainly when we go to Switzerland in May, to explore the various challenges and opportunities in this topic. And I hope the young people here, if you travel or you virtually attend the sessions, find opportunity to link up with newfound friends in Switzerland and elsewhere and pursue some of these projects collectively. So thank you, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion this evening.
Thank you, Minister Lee, for your insightful words. It is truly important and inspiring to see how the Singapore government has taken their plans into the future and considered generations to come, even if that means that they are not here to reap the benefits. Excuse me. Thank you for taking a seat. The panel discussion will now take place. If I could invite the panelists, Mr. Wong Ms. Iris Zemzoum, Mr. Victor Mills, and our moderator, Tony Ko, to come on stage. The panel session will begin now.
A warm welcome to the Gallen Symposium Singapore Forum 2023. I'm very excited to be moderating today's panel because it is our first post-pandemic panel. As you know, Northeast Asia, China, Hong Kong, they've recently opened up, and it's wonderful to be here on stage with all of you in person without having to necessarily have our masks on. This evening, we are gathered to talk about the theme of the symposium, which is intergenerational contracts, or a new intergenerational contract. But more importantly, it's about anchoring that discussion in our Singapore context. And as Minister has shared earlier in his presentation and remarks on urban planning in Singapore, it is something that is relevant, timely, and important for us to think about. So now that we have segued into the panel discussion, I look forward to receiving questions from all of you in the audience. So I encourage all of you to start this evening by thinking about a few questions that you might want to ask the panel in the next few minutes. Please keep your questions short, and we'll move to the Q&A session in a short bit. But before that, I wanted to start by introducing the panel. And I realized I also forgot to introduce myself. Good evening, everyone. My name is Tommy. I go by Tommy Ko, but if I mention Tommy Ko, you'll all think about the professor. So my name is Tommy for all intents and purposes this evening. And I was the leader of tomorrow at the 48th and 49th Gallen Symposium, which took place in 2018 and 2019. And I also chair the Gallen Symposium Singapore chapter. We're very grateful to have an esteemed panel with us this evening. We have Mr. Victor Mills, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Singapore International Chamber of Commerce, or SICC. We have Dr. Iris Zemzoum, who is the president of Novartis, not just looking at Asia, but also the Middle East and Africa. Of course, we have Minister Desmond Lee, who is our Minister for National Development, and we have Mr. Wong who is the CEO of HSBC Singapore. Our panelists this evening are leaders not just in their fields and organizations, but also in the country and in the region. So I'm looking forward to hearing their insights. As everyone starts thinking about a question that they might want to ask, I wanted to kick off the panel by encouraging our panelists to share a very short reaction, so perhaps a minute long, on what resilience means in your individual sectors or in your individual organizations. We've heard from Minister that resilience might look like planning for urban development in the longer term and preserving optionality, which is something that's important at the national level. But in individual fields and sectors as well as organizations, what does resilience mean? We've heard this term very often post-pandemic, and I wanted to start perhaps with Victor to share your thoughts on what resilience means to you.
Okay, thank you, Tommy. Can everybody hear me? Good. Resilience, I think, is an attitude. It's an attitude of mind, and it's also intentional. So the minister talked about resilience in the form of planning for the future and doing it in an intentional way, doing it in a way that is selfless rather than selfish. And I think it's the same in any business. A business wants to continue to survive and therefore plans to do so. And I think from my perspective, running a chamber, which represents lots of different businesses, it's really the value that we can bring to our members in order for us to achieve resilience. Because at the end of the day, if we don't do that, we won't retain our members. So that would be my initial response.
Thanks, Victor. I think that's a fascinating insight into how resilience isn't just individual, but something that's collective. Perhaps, Iris, over to you.
Yes, I'm trying to be as short.
Victor started us off well. Thank you.
Maybe first a personal reflection. I've relocated to Singapore in 2020 in the midst of the pandemic. And your beautiful speech, Minister Lee, has reminded me my admiration for how Singapore has, in the past 30, 40 years, really built an amazing legacy for the new generations to come, but also how wonderfully and perfectly, in my opinion, has managed a pandemic which could have caused in a city-state with such, and you mentioned that, the density of the population, it could have been devastating. So I know when I arrived, there were many comments on, losing the freedom, not being able to travel, but no one has really realized, at least maybe at that time, maybe in hindsight, how important it was to be thinking forward and to think for the generations to come and be very disciplined. Now, whether I'm sitting here as a citizen or as a medical doctor that I am, or as a president of a region in a pharmaceutical company, for me, healthcare systems is the most important pillar. A resilient generation, a resilient business, a resilient community can only be resilient if we do invest in healthcare and if we strengthen our healthcare systems. I mean, we all saw what happened from one day to another if we are not prepared to a crisis like we lived through with the COVID pandemic. And beyond a pandemic, which is maybe something that we haven't been foreseeing, though there were scenarios from WHO, which we haven't really taken serious enough. If we look at today, with the aging population, we know that if we would not pay attention enough in diagnosis, in prevention of certain large diseases, and I'm thinking, for example, of something that probably we all have accepted, cardiovascular diseases. We are all aging and we will all want to live 100 years, but we won't. Or if we do, we will be costing a government or a healthcare system trillions. I mean, we have forecasts of what this would mean for a generation to come. So that would be, for me, the most important part, and I'm shortening my speech. I'm very passionate. I'm very sorry for that, but I'm very passionate about healthcare. Yes. And I think all of us have a responsibility to invest in our individual, but also in the society's healthcare and systems.
Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Iris. I think your sharing was a good reminder that we need to think about prerequisites that help enable other forms of resilience, and healthcare and health is definitely one of them. Perhaps over to Kiju.
Well, I think for me, coming from financial services, and you know that financial services really contributes a lot to Singapore's economy and to the jobs here. When I think about resiliency, it's really about long-term sustainability. So when I look at what happened to us through COVID and getting prepared, from a financial services perspective, I think we were very fortunate that we had invested a lot into digitization, into a lot of new digital tools that have come to place. And that really then created a level of resiliency in the financial system. I can't imagine today if COVID had hit and none of us were prepared and everyone was still taking out their checkbooks and trying to get payments and still using notes, right? We would have put ourselves in a very, very difficult position. So I think from a financial perspective, resiliency comes to mind when we look at our ability to be nimble, to adapt to change, and also taking bold moves, right, really to increase the tensile strength, right, of our system. So, one interesting point, that I was taking note of is that, you look at lead, right, lead is actually very soft, very malleable, but do you know if you hit lead multiple times over, it can become stronger than steel, right? So, within our system itself, sometimes we take hard knocks, but I think through that effort, I think it gives us that ability, right, to become much stronger and much more resilient. So that's something that we always need to strive towards from a longer term perspective.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kiju. I think the key insight I gleaned from that was that if we look at hard knocks and the challenges and the crises that we face, if we can avoid being fragile and being broken, we can transform that into core areas of strength. So we're going to turn to the audience in a very short while for your questions. And in the St. Gallen spirit, we really encourage you to use the 2 microphones to ask your questions. Although I also want to point out that we have a QR code here on screen if you would prefer to key in your questions. And we will ask the top voted question to the panel in a short while. But while you gather your thoughts, I wanted to go one more round with the panel to talk about the intergenerational contract. So, as you heard from Alyssa earlier this evening, the Symposium's 2023 theme is a new generational contract. And as we know, contracts often are a sum of their parts. We have provisions, we have articles, I used to negotiate FTAs, we have specific commitments that we make in contracts, and that really ensures that contracts are robust and fit for purpose. I wanted to ask the panelists for one provision or one principle in an intergenerational contract that you think is important to maintain resilience, given that we're talking about economic resilience, we're talking about social resilience. So if we think about that one principle that any intergenerational contract must have, what would it be? Minister, perhaps you can start with you.
It would be a combination of stewardship and trust, very critical. The mindset of stewardship means that each generation, whether you're a senior, whether you're a person in the middle age, whether you're a younger person, you don't just think about yourself or your generation, but recognize that you have a duty towards other generations, both ahead of you and after you. And trust is critical, because if we don't trust each other across the generations, then you start to see some of that intergenerational politics that I think can easily rear its ugly head as limited resources get fought over by older people, by younger people, and then the generation not yet born just completely get cut out.
Thanks, Minister. Perhaps we can go to Kiju next. From financial services, if we think about things like affordability, access to financial services, bankability, what does it mean to have provisions in an intergenerational contract?
I think for financial services, and the way that we look at this is really around the genesis and then thinking around a common purpose. So when we look at what Minister was talking about trust and the rest, but if we don't have a common purpose in terms of what we're striving for, you can't have a contract where people agree. You can't have a contract where someone decides to go left, someone decides to go right, without a common purpose in place. So I think for me, really one of the key tenets around this is that we need to have a common purpose. And one of the things in which I've seen Singapore do very well is really from a financial services perspective, for example, is to drive around the Green Plan 2030, right, where it's a whole of nation effort. So it's a common purpose that we have to strive for. It's an existential threat. It's one where all component parts of society, whether you're young, you're old, whether you're an SME, whether you're in financial services, everyone has to play a part, right? And I think that common purpose then drives us, with that longer term view of what we need to do, the stewardship, the responsibility that comes into place. So these, I think, components are really important for us to consider.
Great. And perhaps turning to Iris, from the healthcare sector, if we think, we've heard about stewardship, we've heard about trust, we've heard about common purpose, and these are broad themes that are important in contracts, but especially in healthcare, where we are really looking at the specific details, and we're looking at things like experimentation, we're looking at things like patents. What is the implication of an intergenerational contract, and how do you manage to keep that robust and something that's relevant for the future?
Similar, in the healthcare industry, purpose is at the heart. And I think our purpose is to bring innovative medicines to patients and to meet their needs. And you only can do that if you have a very clear vision of how you can create value to the society. And knowing that our environment is changing at a rapid pace, the one thing that will enable us to pursue our vision and our purpose is agility. And I don't want to refer again to any pandemic or crisis, but we know today that if we are not agile in adapting to the changing environment, we can have the best purpose and the best vision, we won't be able to succeed. So agility would be the one thing that I would add to the round.
Thanks, Iris. So we'll add agility to the list. And Victor, you have the last word on this. So we have stewardship, trust, common purpose, and agility. And I hope you would also speak a little bit about the how. So if we think about a contract and we wanted to capture these 4 principles, how would we be able to do that? And I know SICC is a chamber that brings together various members from a diversity of different sectors. So I think as an aggregator of sorts or interlocutor of sorts, the how would be very important.
I mean, my response would be what we all need is collaborative innovation. And that is enabled by trust based on purpose. The purpose is stewardship, the purpose is fairness. The how, as Iris says, we've got to be agile, we've got to be experimental, we've got to be brave enough to take experiments and learn from the results. And if they don't produce the results we would like them to, then we take another agile decision and try something else. I think the final thing would be we have to, while recognizing the differences between generations, the collaborative innovation is further enabled by age blindness. In other words, see the fellow human being first, not the age. I mean, something that we do very well in Singapore, we don't discriminate based on race. We don't discriminate based on belief. What we do is we include and celebrate the differences that exist. And I think that would be a wonderful way to enable the collaborative innovation that we so all desperately need to deal with the existential threat surrounding us, whether it be climate change or any other threat.
Thanks, Victor. I think that notion of age inclusiveness is a very important dimension of ensuring that the key principles that the other panelists have shared are enshrined in a contractual manner. All right. So over to the audience. We've gone through 2 rounds of questions, so hopefully that's more than enough time for everyone to have formed your thoughts and come up with a sentence or 2. Again, I ask that in asking your question, if you could keep your question short, that would enable us to collect a couple of different questions for our panelists to answer. So since there's always an awkward silence before the first question, can we move on to the second question? If anyone would like to ask the second question. There are 2 microphones in the aisles for the first person to ask the second question.
Good evening. I am Dio Gracious Lion from the Philippines. I just traveled straight from the Philippines just for this forum, by the way. Anyway, my question goes to Mr. Desmond Lee. Singapore has been the jet setter of the world's leading national development. What should be the core value that other nations could replicate and embrace in becoming more than what it takes to be a sustainably resilient state, charging forward for the next generation?
Right. Thank you very much. Perhaps, Minister, if you'd like to take that first, then in the next round of questions, we'll collect a few.
I will need about 2 hours to
Minister, you have 1 minute.
1 minute. Okay, that's very generous.
Maybe 2.
Yeah. So first and foremost, I think we recognize that we are a small city-state, and the countries around us are all far larger. So we don't purport to teach other people anything. We look after our city. We have a responsibility to our people. We try to do it to the best of our ability. There are hits and misses. There are problems that we still have to grapple with. But I think the key to us having been able to bring this city together is the building of trust, as I said earlier, and making sure that very limited resources are shepherded and stewarded. And land is so short in Singapore, and natural resources are non-existent. So everything we have is a function of the drive and willpower of the city's people, those Singaporeans and friends who come and contribute. And so careful planning, whether it's in land use, careful planning in our healthcare system, in housing and anything else, has been a strategy that has served us well. We don't do everything well. We have things that we don't do well, but I think just putting our head together working with people, planning carefully, but also planning longer term, has enabled the city to function the way it has. And we hope to contribute whatever little that we've learned over the decades through forums such as the World City Summit, where we not only invite mayors and governors of other cities and provinces to come to Singapore to see what we do, but also it's a wonderful opportunity for Singapore to learn from all the cities around the world as well. So it's mutual respect, and mutual trust, and mutual learning from each other.
Thank you very much, sir.
All right.
Tommy, if I could just add
Yes,
one thing.
please, Victor.
And I think the enabler of all of those things that the Minister so eloquently spoken about is intentional people-centric governance. If I look at the swathe of modern Singapore from the time the Republic was established in 1965, that is the overwhelming characteristic. That drives everything else. That then creates the trust that sustains us and our society. I think it's got to be people-centric governance, not selfish elites running away and doing their own thing for their own benefit, but people-centric governance.
Thank you, Victor. I think that's definitely a good point, and it also goes to the Minister's point about mutual learning, where people-centric governance, not just in Singapore, but also to learn from our regional counterparts or our global counterparts to see what they're doing in order to uphold those people-centric governance principles that you talk about. Wanted to go back to the audience, and perhaps this time we can collect a couple of questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, the gentleman in the blue short-sleeved shirt up front, please.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Zemzoum from Temasek Junior College, Singapore. So I have one question to ask. Just now, Minister, you addressed actually resilience is very important to Singapore in the past, now, and in the future. So I want to ask, as we know Singapore is a country that is highly dependent on importing goods from other countries, and during the relationship with other countries is very vital for Singapore. So, like, how resilient it is for Singapore in a globalized world like today, we're dealing with different crises and other conflicts around the world to deal with the relationship with other countries.
Thanks very much. Minister, perhaps we'll collect a couple of questions.
First, Minister, I'd like to thank you for your speech and panelists for your time and insights. Obviously, Minister, as you mentioned in your speech, we're in a very complex moment right now in the world from a geopolitical perspective, from a macroeconomic perspective, emerging from the pandemic. So the question I have for all of you is, given these very short-term and immediate challenges, how do you balance, from a political and business perspective, balance addressing these short-term challenges and thinking about the future in the long term? Do you see a trade-off between that? And I'd just love to hear your insights on that. Thank you so much.
Yes, the gentleman in white, the white t-shirt.
So thanks for your speech. So actually I'm a student here, but I have been involved in this year's GLSA 2022 Global Leadership Challenge, and we have discussed intergenerational contract. But it's very complex. It's not just about climate change. It has many different problems such as gender equality and widening inequality, wealth distribution. And in 2023, the World Economic Forum has predicted almost all the countries in the world has the risk into a recession, and the Russian-Ukraine wars and the geopolitical risk is rising worldwide. Do you think the history is predicting or repeating itself? How are we could be more informed or resilient in the future? Because I think now everything is changing faster and faster, and it's very difficult to navigate through these times. Sometimes we might feel very powerless. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the questions. So I think I just wanted to also be conscious that there are some audience members who are asking questions on Pigeonhole. And if we can lump that together with the last gentleman's questions, I think two key themes of concern are around affordability, So specifically, steps Singapore is taking to overcome current inflation, as well as increasing housing prices, and specifically if it's possible to cut down on HDB costs. So, Minister, I think those are questions that you might want to engage with. But let's open it to the entire panel first. I think we've got a nice group of questions where, in the first instance, we're really interested in the external context. So we have a question about reliance on trade in goods and how we can be resilient in terms of our international engagements. I think this is something that the entire panel can speak to, because it's something that is not just national, but it's something that organizations also have to do. In addition to that, I think that's also a very nice link to the last question we've had about how things are changing and how we can maintain resilience. And I know, Iris, you used the word agility earlier. So how can we position ourselves in a way that prepares ourselves for these future challenges? And I think the question from Zachary would be useful for all the panelists to engage with as well, which is how to balance between short and long-term goals. So are there any opportunity costs? So perhaps we can take that bucket of questions first, then we'll come back to the ones about, well, specifically affordability and housing, perhaps then for Minister to answer. So Victor, could I ask that you get us started again on the external context as well as on trade-offs?
All right, so I mean, obviously a small city-state like Singapore has no choice but to engage with the rest of the world in order to survive and thrive. And Singapore has been a remarkable beneficiary of globalization in the last 30, 40 years. And notwithstanding the fact that globalization has come under some threat in recent years, you only have to look at the extent of our free trade agreements and the diversification of the markets where we source for food and other goods to show that that is how we manage the risk. We diversify our sources in order to maintain a quality of life for the citizens and residents of this country. And it's very similar in a business. In a business today, people are talking about nearshoring production, not necessarily going for the cheapest supply chain anymore, because that has been proven during the pandemic to be very weak because of too many multiple links. And instead building resilience by shortening the supply chain itself. So I would say that would be my response to that larger question. In terms of the short-term versus long-term, it's all a question of priority. And obviously, short-term issues need to be addressed, but at the same time, you can't lose sight of the bigger picture. Just as the Minister was sharing that even a few years after independence, Singapore was already planning for Marina Bay. And that shows intentional planning and stewardship for the future, while at the same time, Singapore was focusing on providing adequate housing for its population and job creation in order to build a vibrant economy to enable the population of Singapore to thrive and for the economy to grow. So it's a prioritization play.
Thanks very much, Victor. Perhaps over to Iris, and Iris, especially on the front of international supply chains, going to what Victor said. Clearly, the pandemic has shown that supply chains in the healthcare sector are very important. Vaccine access was a key bottleneck or a key challenge early on in the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And in principle, I'm very much aligned with what Victor said. I'd like to add maybe a different perspective beyond, of course, short-term issues that we might have from time to time and not losing the sight for the long term. I'd like to make a call for action for all the students, the coming generation of leaders that are today here in the auditorium. You do have it in your hands of how you want to deal with the future and the future generations to come. And that on both topics, whether it's on the short-term or long-term objectives, you do not have to choose between the two. You are absolutely able, if you have a very clear vision of where you want to go, you still have to live in the day and plan for the day and make sure, and independently of which industry you're in or whether you're in a government, you just have to have a very clear vision of what you want to achieve and what are the priorities and what you need to do today to still be able to sustain what you have planned for the future. The second call for action, it's about the comment that we had that is history repeating itself? Unfortunately, we do see that again and again, that history sometimes is repeating itself. Here, my call for action, you do have it in your hand. You can learn from the past experiences as much as we can learn from the crisis that we just went through, the health crisis with COVID. We know where our gaps are. We know whether it's the supply chain or the investment in the infrastructure, in a hospital, we know exactly nowadays where our gaps and weaknesses are. But unfortunately, human memory is sometimes very short. So train your memory. Make sure that whatever you do tomorrow, you don't forget about what happened. So, I mean, it's a very simple message, but I'm a big fan and believer in empowerment and in self-accountability and responsibility, whether it's in leadership or in whatever context you are. So you do have it in your hand. I said it many times, and I'm serious about it.
Thanks very much, Iris. I think those are two very useful calls for action, and we will turn to the other panelists in summation later to hear more calls for action, because it's very important that we don't just talk, but we also act. But before we do that, I think, Iris, what you mentioned about not just having short and long-term trade-offs, but also short and long-term alignment is something that's very helpful. Before turning to Minister, I wanted to turn to Kiju and ask specifically about when there are situations where there are trade-offs, what are we going to do in those situations, and how can we manage that along with the external environment that we were talking about?
I think when we look at the trade-offs and, if you have to look at short-term, long-term, I think once clearly we have to prioritize, right? What really needs addressing right now. But at the same time too, I think as we address short-term challenges, we should also bear in mind how they can have longer-term implications, right? So when I look at today, some of the short-term challenges that companies might be facing, and some of them are really around, the ESG space, right? Getting their supply chains to be a lot more green, right? But at the same time, it's a short-term focus that you have to adhere to because they've got standards they need to meet for the shorter term. But at the same time, too, it also gives them an opportunity to build for the much longer term. Right? So I think as companies are looking into these areas, right? You prioritize what you need to undertake, but also with a view of leveraging what you're undertaking from a shorter term that gives you strengths, right, from a longer term perspective. So I think you build all this into, your planning process. And I think to, Iris's point, it's really about, when we look at all these ideas that come out, it's really about different generations coming together and coming out with, cozy ideas that really can be kind of like interwoven, right, into a fabric, right? It makes it much stronger, right? It makes it, the plans a lot more resilient. So, there's always that saying, you can't teach old dogs new tricks, right? I like to think that this old dog can still learn some new tricks from the younger generation. And I've realized this through my own journey, working with a lot of young people. And even my two daughters, right, they teach me a lot. When I go into the organization and you get ideas from everyone, because a lot of the new challenges we face today are not challenges that people maybe in my generation, my youth, I went through. Right, so there are a lot of times whereby, when you get ideas coming in from different generations and really good ideas, it gives us, thought processes that, have never really clicked before, right? So it gives us that sort of a view. So I think that dialogue is really important, and it brings us to, some of the topics we had last year on collaborative advantage, right? And how, the younger generation, our generation, maybe the slightly older ones, can work together to develop new solutions for the future with a view of stewardship and how do we leave the next legacy. So I think as this generation looks towards expecting us to leave a legacy for them, I think the challenge too is around the younger generation, the sort of mindset you have on stewardship and what sort of future will you leave for the generations that come after you, as much as you expect the same from our generation to leave for you. So I think this is something for us to think about.
Thanks very much, Kiju. I think the point that the young generation today is not just a recipient of intergenerational contracts, but also owners and contributors to a new intergenerational contract for the people who will come after them is something that's manifestly important. Minister, perhaps over to you. So the three big buckets of external environment, trade-offs, as well as I think some of the concerns around the table around affordability.
Well, I thought Kiju, Iris, and Victor answered a lot of it, but I just want to supplement with some thoughts. I mean, Singapore is so small, and we want to make sure we learn the right lessons from COVID. And, we make the best of plans, we make contingencies, we provide redundancies, we diversify. But this crisis of a generation really pushed it to the limits and tested all the plans and SOPs we had in place. In some areas we did well, in some areas we fell short, but the spirit of wanting to learn from what has gone well and what has gone badly, I think it's important, that kind of mindset. Keep wanting to learn, have an AAR, and so whether it's in your school, whether it's in your organization, you've done something, outcome has been achieved, always wanting to reflect right immediately after the heat of the moment to see what learning can be extracted from that and to turn that into positive action, to be ready for the next challenge, whether it's the same challenge, a morph of it, or something totally new. And I just want to address the issue of supply chain and resilience. The point is that we cannot produce everything in Singapore. It's not possible. Even if we think we can, actually there will be some component or item that needs to come from somewhere else. There's no running away from it. And how we deal with it here in Singapore, firstly, diversification. Victor got it spot on. You diversify so that you get sources from a number of places. But sometimes even diversification has its Achilles heel. And just population resilience and adaptability. A certain kind of food source cannot come in, you adapt and adjust accordingly. A certain kind of component cannot come in, affects your way of life, adapt, pick ourselves up. And that gives you extra stretchability. We want, of course, to maintain good relations with everyone around us. I think that's key for a city-state. But ultimately, we also are strong supporters of a global rules-based order. And it's a no-brainer, right, for a small city-state that for countries big and small, if we continue to support a rules-based order, then whatever challenges may come our way, that there is some basis upon which to resolve our differences, regardless of your size or your heft. So I think those are ways in which we ensure that we get the things that we need for our people. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure we live like an island. And that's where circularity, that's where sustainability, that's where being prudent with the resources that we have or that we bring on board, less waste, more efficiency, valuing what we have, I think is critical and important, not just for climate change, but also for the way of life that we have. Lastly, of course, it's the recognition that government cannot do everything, business cannot do everything on their own. And during the COVID crisis, the ability for government and the private sector, government and the people sector, government, the private sector and the people sector working together to tackle different phases and different aspects of the crisis, for me was a real takeaway. When supply chains were disrupted, we had captains of industry, we had people in the private sector who had access to supply chains, who had contacts around the world, and we could then, who flew Singapore's flag. And in a time of crisis, that there were people who could put boots on the ground, get things that Singapore needed to keep people safe and to keep jobs going. And certainly in the people sector too, whether it was to tackle the dormitory infection crisis, whether it was to tackle a mass outbreak of COVID and people were stuck at home, how to deliver groceries to the door for people who were quarantining at home, protecting our seniors, and that intergenerational compact was put to the test. Young people having to cut back a lot on their activities that they take for granted, school, physical school, CCA, going out with their friends, because grandpa, grandma at home, vulnerable, no vaccine yet. And I think that was a teachable moment, and I think our young people rose to the occasion. And I think our seniors, were kept safe, but the seniors also played their part. So that for me was a key takeaway. Resilience, socially resilience in terms of supply chain and so on. And then on the point of trade-offs, short-term versus long-term, I think Kiju hit the nail on the head. Some things make sense in the short term, look like a good quick fix, but sometimes they have a long tail and they can create certain perverse incentives. Some of these are obvious or discernible. Sometimes things have a long tail, and then it has an effect on the policy, has a longer term effect that is unintended. And that is why it's always important sometimes to just pilot things and get a feel, but also to do comparative studies of how people have done it overseas and whether it's succeeded or not. One example is, for us, because of the city-state, how you house a nation. And I'm just casting my mind back to the early generation of leaders when they started thinking about how to address poor housing conditions. Poor housing conditions. How do you tackle slums? Could you have just built and let people rent, right, and copy some models overseas? Or do you do what we did today, which is build, heavily subsidize, make it a major pillar of society and government, and have a home-owning society? Some of these decisions made those many decades ago have implications decades later, and some of these implications cannot be fully anticipated. And therefore, it is always important for us, whether in government or business or in the people sector, to remember the genesis of the decisions made, of the rules that exist around us, never assume, know the origins, and then be ready to be pragmatic, to tailor those policies and rules to meet today's needs, because society continues to change, and some of these longer tail, longer term implications that may not always have been obvious to the originators of the policy when they start to surface. So I think that recognition that you're a steward of policies, even though they're made long ago, is something that, as a very young person in public service, we learn. Then, of course, on affordability of housing.
Minister, you just have about 30 seconds for this. So affordability of housing.
Housing, come and simulator. Come and simulator. But the long and short of this is affordable housing is a major pillar of our social compact. The last 2 years, because of COVID, because of delays, because of this generation setting up home, this whole perfect storm of conditions have led to the HDB resale market and the private market going up significantly. We have made it very clear through a series of housing cooling measures that we want to make sure there's stability in the housing market, doesn't run away from economic fundamentals. But unlike a buoyant property market in a buoyant economic climate, tackling a buoyant property market at a time of COVID, I think requires some circumspection and care that you calibrate appropriately. But this is something we watch carefully. We are not afraid to take appropriate measures. We've pumped in a lot more housing, 100,000 new homes in the next, from 2021 to 2025. We're launching more private housing. But on the BTO side, which is highly subsidized, we have kept homes to about 5 years of total salary. All right, so for different demographic groups that we model for, it is about 5 years of your total salary to buy a home, as compared to, say, 20 years in Hong Kong, and between 8 to 13 or 15 years in different parts of the world. All right, and most Singaporeans pay a quarter or less of their monthly household income for their mortgage, a quarter or less. And when we look at other cities, comparable cities, it is about a third to 35%. of their monthly household income that is used. But because of our CPF system, right, those who have CPF, and because they pay a quarter or less of their monthly household income to their mortgage, most do not need to pay cash. They just rely on their CPF payments. So that holds. We understand the stresses and strains on the resale market side. We recognize there's some concern on the mature estate BTO flats. For example, flats right in the center of Ang Mo Kio. Those continue to be highly subsidized. And remember that in BTO, we are catering to Singaporeans whose incomes reach the ceiling of $14,000, which is 70th percentile of Singaporean or resident household income, which means we cater our BTO to not just the lower to middle income, but even the upper middle income. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minister. Hopefully that gives all the young people in the room some assurance about the continued affordability of both housing as well as other measures moving forward. We've had a very rich discussion this evening. I think we've talked about the why, about resilience, about intergenerational contracts. We've talked about themes like stewardship, trust, purpose, agility. And we're at time, so we won't have time for another round of questions, but I wanted to give all the panelists an opportunity in 30 seconds, no more than 30 seconds, I will cut you off, to leverage or harness Iris's earlier comment about how the younger generation have it in their hands to do something. So given that that's the clarion call, that's the call to action, the next question or the next thing that we should think about is how. So if there was going to be one tangible action that the young people, the leaders of today, as well as the leaders of tomorrow in the room here and the audience will be able to undertake after walking out of the doors of the Gallen Symposium Singapore Forum this evening, what would that one action be? And in no more than 30 seconds, perhaps Kiju can start us off.
I guess there was no pressure, Tommy. In 30 seconds, I would say speak up, right? Get involved. Don't feel that you don't have a voice. I'm going to borrow from the government when they say that it's a whole of government effort. I would say I'll change it to say it's a whole of generation effort, right? That all generations can contribute, must contribute for our future. We're all stewards of Singapore. We're all stewards of the economy here.
Whole of generation effort. Perhaps Iris.
Yeah. Have the courage to mentor the more senior leaders. This is what we do in our organization, reverse mentorship, and it's wonderful. Have the courage to do that.
A whole of generation effort, take the effort to do reverse mentoring. Vector, 30 seconds.
And collaborate with humility. We're all imperfect humans. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. And also, don't make assumptions. Test your assumptions with humility.
Lead with humility. And Minister, you have the last word. How should our youth act? What is one
I should use
tangible?
10 seconds because I use a lot of my 30 seconds. First is, I think, seek deeper understanding. I think in a social media, fast-paced social media world, with a shorter attention span, seek deeper understanding of whatever you're faced with. Second, seek broader diversity. Avoid echo chambers where you surround yourself with people who are all of the same viewpoint. Yep. And search for diverse rooms. Search for people with opposing views from yours and build a consensus.
Thank you very much, Minister and panelists. I think all that's left for me to do is to thank the panelists. We started off with Ambassador's quip about what has the future generation done for me? And I think now we have transitioned to a broader understanding as to what we can do collectively to prepare for the future generation. So please join me in thanking all the panelists for joining us this evening. And thanks also to the audience for the fantastic questions, both in person as well as online. All right, Alyssa, back to you.
Thank you, Tommy. I can only reiterate thank you to all the speakers as well as yourself and all the previous speakers as well for their insights. May I now invite Mr. James So, Executive Director of the NYAA, onto stage to present the speakers with a token of appreciation. Continuing on, I would like to invite Mr. Alexander C. Melchers, the Special Advisor of the Gallen Symposium, for some closing remarks. Alex?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I thought it was a very, very interesting, highly engaging panel. And thank you, Minister, for your speech. I want to pick up in my closing remark on one term that you used, which I think is also very important, and that is the term of ownership. I think ownership matters. And 50 years ago, just to remind again, it was students from the University of St. Gallen who started this St. Gallen Symposium. And that was 52 years ago today, but that was a time which maybe it's not repeating, but maybe rhyming in terms of history. So we had high inflation in Europe. We had an energy crisis. We had a war raging in Vietnam, which was a proxy war too. The Club of Rome had just come out with its first very alarming report about the limits of growth. And students were actually fighting and revolting. Just like today, we read about students gluing themselves to roads and streets in Germany, and demonstrations and unhappiness. So it was a similar time where this symposium was started by students. 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago, I was a student at the University of St. Gallen. And it was a different time. The wall had just come down in Europe, and we were all very positive, but also challenged. I was a student leader at that time. And then 20 years ago, I was here in Singapore as a manager and connected with James. And we started to promote the symposium here in Singapore. And it was in 2003 where then Minister Mabutan, National Development, was invited to come to Singapore, to St. Gallen on very, very short notice at that time to talk about Singapore's experience with SARS. At that time, SARS was probably contained here in Singapore, and Singapore prevented SARS to become a global pandemic. And Singapore took very harsh measures for what it was somehow criticized for, but Mabutan was then in St. Gallen and really explained what worked, and I remember we had standing ovations. And from then on it continued. We had Taman, finance minister, who coined the phrase social trampoline in St. Gallen. The YouTube video has, I think, 1.4 million views by now. It was a very important speech that he gave. And then we had your 4G leader colleagues, Chan Chun Sing and Lawrence Wong, Heng Swee Kiat, and Ong Yi Kang, who came to St. Gallen. And therefore, we are very, very happy and grateful, Minister, that you are here today and that you will continue this relationship and that you will also come to St. Gallen at the symposium now. The symposium has brought more than 250 Singaporean students to Switzerland. For this, what you call all-paid trip, so students who qualified through the essay contest and who then invited. Many of them today are in very senior leadership positions here in Singapore, members of parliament too, so it's a very strong initiative. And I must really remind and cannot overemphasize, it is done, and it has always been done, by students. Alisa is the student right now. There are many, many more students who organize this event, who sacrifice their time, who take ownership for this theme and for this topic. And if there's any overarching theme that the St. Gallen Symposium over the last 50 years has really followed through, and that's the second topic that you mentioned, it's the rule-based global system. St. Gallen is not dogmatic about how democracy has to operate, but we are very much for a free and open and liberal rule-based world. And any of the problems that we are today facing can only be solved if we can set ourselves some rules and if we can then follow these rules, everybody in the world. And I think that's the overarching theme, and that can only be resolved by everybody in the room. We talk about the generational contract and compact and contract. And, you know, when you are in my age, I don't even know where I am. Am I already old? Am I young? You know, there are many people much older than me, and it's a process, you know, and you still cannot believe that you're actually belonging to the elder generation, and we are talking to young people when it seems so recent that we also felt very young, and actually we still do. So with this, I want to thank James for organizing this event. I want to thank the university for hosting us, and of course the panel speakers to have given their time on a Friday evening. I'm also a family person, I know what it means. So Beat for coming from Switzerland, but the biggest thank you really to the students of the St. Gallen team. I think Alisa is here, Fabian is somewhere in the room, I don't know where he is. There are many more students in St. Gallen, and also the Singapore chapter student, Tommy and Brian and Timmy, sorry. Yeah, so many more who are here and who support the cause and the effort that we take for St. Gallen. So with that, I wish you a great Friday night. I think we have some continuation. I hope, Minister, you can have some more time. I think some people want to ask more questions about inflation and HDB, and you invited it. And that has always been the case. Mabotan, you remember HDB and housing cost was always a topic when you were in the room. Of course, it's very close to the Singapore heart. So with that, a big thank you, and good evening, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alex. I can only reiterate what he said. Thank you again to all the organizers, all the speakers, Minister Desmond Lee, Ambassador Grütter. Yes, there are light refreshments outside, and we strongly encourage you guys to socialize and talk to the person next to you on the row behind you, because you never know who you're sitting next to. So please, if you guys would head out the door on my left-hand side, we can continue outside.